When we think about effective leadership, what do we mean by that? What's the role of a leader? Let's define that. We see up top here, someone who exercises an influence over other people. And indeed, we'll see as we move forward within this particular mind map that in order to exercise that influence properly or effectively, leaders need to have some skills, maybe even some traits. Leaders are at the front. What they've got to do is they've got to set the vision in some way and get people to follow them. In terms of the role, we talk about setting the vision. Bear with me one second. Setting the vision and indeed the mission. We should be familiar with these terms. We know that vision and mission are all really about the purpose of the organization and indeed the preferred future. So really at the outset, let's say that a business sets up, they appoint a leader. Really, that's one of the first things that needs to be done. And indeed, leaders or good leaders, effective leaders, they have to lead from the front with the vision and the mission in mind. I guess next to that would be the overall objectives. In other words, the corporate objectives. So in essence, we have a sort of a hierarchy, don't we? We start with mission, vision, we go to goals and objectives, and it sort of cascades down the organization into sort of other metrics, CSFs, KPIs, etc., etc. In addition to that, certainly the leader is responsible for deciding on organizational structure. And we'll see later on in the course that there's certainly a variety of different choices in terms of structure, and indeed that structure, or indeed the choice of that structure, does affect the ability of a leader to lead. You've got to get it right. Last thing, of course, is performance. Without good performance, none of the first three matter too much. But I guess you have to have them in place in order to achieve performance. Performance will be based on working towards our targets, working towards our objectives. Moving on from there, obviously, in terms of the mission and vision, I think we know what they are. How do they fit into the sort of broader area of strategy for a business? Well, we'll know that the sort of the formal approach, or if you will, the sort of rational approach for a leader to devise strategy for a business is a fairly long-winded approach. And indeed, as I said up top, it starts with these areas. I'd refer you later on in the course to the three-part model, Johnson, Scholes and Whittington: analysis, choice, and implementation. Those are the three phases, I guess, starting with this area of establishing the mission and vision. And indeed, the leader is going to oversee those areas, not to be directly involved in analysis and indeed choice and implementation, but certainly to oversee the devising of strategy for the company, starting with these. Let's move on from there. When we talk about effective leaders, certainly in your experience, perhaps in my experience, they certainly will have some particular traits. What is a trait? Well, some sort of quality, a characteristic, let's say, a good personality, good communication skills, etc., directness, interpersonal skills, etc. So, Stodgdale in 1974, came up with a series of traits and indeed sort of skills associated with successful and indeed effective leaders. You'll see that I've just cut and pasted some of them here. I won't read through them. Certainly you understand what they mean. The essence of this is, though, that certainly, if we were to come across a SBL exam question and we were to be asked anything in the area of effectiveness of the leader, then I would be looking for these sorts of things to be mentioned. Clearly, many of them are fairly commonsensical. A leader has to be assertive, certainly has to be achievement orientated. In terms of skills, certainly diplomacy and tactfulness is absolutely essential. So when we think about sort of traits and skills, let's think about the obvious ones, and also let's look for them in scenarios if we get any question in that sort of vein. When we look towards sort of McCall and Lombardo, remember that we don't need to remember the details of the particular theorists, certainly not. What we just need to get a fix on is the broad idea, the broad tenets of theories underlying effective leadership. So we've seen a few. Yeah. Outside of that, let's take a look at what McCall and Lombardo suggest. What they suggest is some primary traits, emotional stability and indeed composure. You might call that sort of emotional intelligence. Certainly that phrase is more and more common now, and certainly in my experience of dealing with different business situations, working in public practice, also teaching, lecturing around the world, the ability to be emotionally intelligent, in other words, to be able to control your emotions, is certainly key. Some people can't do it. Admitting error, that's a big one, certainly. We all need to be able to admit errors, certainly leaders. Interpersonal skills, I've mentioned this up top, communication, being a good listener, etc. And indeed, intellectual breadth. What we mean by that is a sort of a knowledge, not necessarily some form of genius, but certainly a knowledge of a number of different areas, perhaps both within the industry or market and perhaps outside of that. At the end of the day, people say that knowledge is power. Let's look at this next area for us, transformational leadership. Certainly when we look back at the business environment over the last 10, 15 years, I've been in business for 35 years, businesses change, the environment changes, and certainly this phrase has become more and more popular. The idea of leaders being able to lead change, or indeed instill in employees, instill in organizations the idea that change is possible, based on planning, based on good communication. So in essence, what we're saying here is that certainly more recently, leaders need to be able to deal with organizational change. And you'll hear me referencing in the change chapter a little bit later on in the course that I saw a stat some years ago which said that, broadly speaking, 70% of all change fails in business. 70%. So change is difficult, and leaders need to be aware of that. They need to plan forward. Now, in terms of, making changes or indeed stages of transformational leadership, first things first, if a change is in play, then certainly the vision forward in relation to that change needs to be 100% clear. In other words, the idea of, the current state versus the sort of preferred state down the line. The leader needs to sell that vision, needs to communicate that vision to staff, to employees, organization-wide. And in addition to that, obviously, needs to lead from the front in terms of putting that change into play, embedding it and really consolidating once the change has been made. Next area for us is authentic leadership. Now, this is an interesting one because certainly when we look at sort of perhaps some scandals, some horror stories in terms of leaders that perhaps haven't led businesses or organizations as well as they might, the idea of sort of public trust really comes to mind, doesn't it? And there's the idea that really, as a group, public perhaps has lost some trust. You only have to think of some scandals. I've just mentioned a couple there. But, these leaders, as it were, of indeed Enron and indeed other companies, or perhaps leaders of, the main banks, were responsible to a large extent in, leading companies in the wrong way towards disaster. So you could say that trust has been lost. Trust is lost each time we see one of these massive scandals where people are losing their pensions, losing their earnings, etc., etc., etc. So, bottom line is that authentic leadership needs to be sort of understood, and really it links in with the perception. The perception of, how a business should be led, and indeed that leaders need to understand their responsibility towards society, towards the environment, towards their staff. One other key point here is, self-awareness. And I guess you could call this a sort of a quality in one sense. Leaders, we would suggest, need to be self-aware. If you make a mistake, then admit it. And in addition to that, really, third point is that, leaders have to practice. They have to practice being good leaders, and they have to practice what they preach. Okay?